Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger, and heck yes, this episode we are definitely talking about the latest season of Stranger Things. Stranger Things 4. Thus far, as of recording, we have seen the first half of this season, and we are going to talk about my thoughts on this and why I basically think it is arguably one of the most perfect pieces of cinema or TV show presentation that we have seen in a very long time, or at least that I have seen in a very long time. And I'm going to go over all these notes. I made some notes about it, and I'm going to tell you why I think arguably it is one of the most perfect pieces of art, of visual art and audio art to come out in a long time. But first, I just want to do a little plug for EPO. They're not paying me at all. I just very much believe in the store, and I believe what Chris is doing over there with Electronic Parts Outlet. I just want to plug them. Check them out online. I'll give more details about EPO towards the end of the podcast. But basically, you can just Google search EPO or Electronic Parts Outlet if you're curious right now, if you're listening. And check them out. It is a Disneyland for geeks and tinkerers and train enthusiasts and model airplane enthusiasts. It's absolutely nuts. If you need a new belt for your turntable or your cassette player, they've got them. If you need a capacitor for this or that, they've got capacitors. They have circuits. They have circuit components. They have everything you could possibly dream of under the sun. So check out EPO, Electronic Parts Outlet, here in Houston. All right, there's a lot to get through in this episode. So let's just dive into why I think Stranger Things 4, at least, is virtually perfect. And we are going to start with the writing. This is where everything takes shape. This is where the idea that is in the Duffer Brothers' head starts taking form. You can tell, and again, I'm specifically talking about Stranger Things 4. In a nutshell, Stranger Things 4 is just as good as the first season of Stranger Things, but in my opinion, it's actually even better. And that is a rare thing to say. Usually subsequent seasons of TV shows or sequels to movies aren't really as good as the first. They don't capture it. And you could argue, I don't even remember the second season of Stranger Things, honestly, as I'm recording this right now. I remember little pieces of the third. I remember that the second and third seasons they didn't stick with me, at least. They didn't stand out as anything great, and it was kind of like mediocre. I would give Stranger Things 3 a B+, maybe. Whereas season 1 was like an A- in comparison to season 4 now, which is an A+. So that's how good it is. If anything, it's just as good as season 1. Season 4 of Stranger Things is one of the most perfect TV shows I've ever seen in my entire life. So like I said, it starts with the writing. You can tell that the writers are having a lot of fun with this season, that they had a lot of fun writing the season. You can tell that the Duffer Brothers and whoever else may have added to the writing process sat around almost like teenagers being creative and were just bouncing ideas. Well, what about if Dustin does this? Well, what about if Steve does this? What about what this character does this? How this affects this character going down? And you can tell that they wrote and they edited to make the show as fun and interesting and as horrifying as possible. And that I don't want to get ahead of myself here, that they knew what worked in pop culture. And they, as far as pop culture, like movies and things, especially from the 80s, and they also knew what didn't work so that they could avoid it. You can tell that they're having a lot of fun with the writing. You get that perception that they went back to the drawing board for season 4 or whenever they started season 4, and they just kind of they attacked it with full fun, creative gusto, and it really, really shows. So there are elements in the show that I wanted to talk about specifically that help towards this my opinion that it makes the show virtually perfect. So let's start with the horror element. And again, as I'm talking like that, I'm not giving away any spoilers. And if I do start to talk about something that might perceptibly or, conceivably give away a spoiler, I will let you know beforehand, but I don't plan to have any spoilers in this episode. So let's start with the horror element that I alluded to just a moment ago. The horror that they depict here, it masterfully explores the psychological terror and demented imagery. So I'll say that again. The horror element of Stranger Things masterfully explores the psychological terror and demented imagery, like demented Emily Rose style imagery. And I adore that they go there. I adore that when, oh gosh, I don't want to give away too many things. When they depict the people dying, when they depict their bodies being destroyed, I will just say the victims of the main villain in the show, they go there with a close-up and just, if you have ever seen The Exorcism of Emily Rose, that movie, you know what I'm talking about. It's the kind of demented imagery, demented destruction, horrifying, haunting destruction of a human body that I just so much appreciate that they explore that. And the reason I say it like this, because I don't want anybody listening, to think that I'm some sort of like sadist or something and I like to see that stuff. I appreciate artistic expression, and I can hear that the bump music is playing. I'll tell you what the bump music is here coming up in the next segment. But I'm going to explore that horror thing. I'm going to explain myself a little bit better and why I appreciate it so much. You're listening to Geek Therapy Radio. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. You can always visit geektherapyradio.com for more information or to contact me directly. You can find episodes of the podcast there. You can find, like I mentioned, the way to contact me directly. And when you contact me directly, it doesn't sign you up for any mailing list or anything like that. It literally just dings my email inbox saying, you've got a contact through your website. You can also just email me directly, johnny@geektherapyradio.com. That's JOHNNY @geektherapyradio.com. All right, and without further ado, so we don't waste too much more time here because I got a lot to get through in examining why Stranger Things 4 is, in my opinion, one of the most perfect TV series of all time. The fourth season, especially, that's what we're talking about here, specifically is the fourth season of Stranger Things. It is at least, if not better than, the first season of Stranger Things. I know plenty of Stranger Things fans that were kind of let down by seasons 2 and 3. 4 came back firing in all cylinders. You can tell that the creators are having a lot of fun with this. You can tell that the actors are having a lot of fun with this. One of the concerns, because it's so few and far between that seasons of Stranger Things have come out, is that the joke is like, oh, they're adults now. They started out as kids, and now it's like, what are we going to do? We're going to follow them around. Do they have 9-to-5 jobs now at Radio Shack or something? Are they in their mid-20s? How long is this going to go? And the gap between seasons, like, it's very apparent that they're aging. It's not a problem. It has not turned out to be a problem, at least not in my opinion. Stranger Things 4, yeah, they're in high school. They're, more or less, the age group kind of varies between, like Dustin and Steve and things like that. It's a variable age group, but you can tell that it doesn't matter. Yes, they are getting older. That's part of the show. That's written into the show. It's not a factor, and it's not a deterrent, and it's not a distraction. So I ended the last segment talking about and specifying why and how I appreciate the depiction of horror as an element to storytelling, and that I adore the fact that they go there with the imagery. Remember, This is a TV show that's rated TV-14. It's not even rated mature. I told my wife, I was like, I for some scenes, I was like, I wish this was rated mature so they could show, full-on dismemberment and things like that. But I appreciate that they don't. And it's kind of working within the confines of TV-14. I mean, I think 5 years ago, the show definitely would have been rated mature. But I appreciate working within the confines of TV-14 because it forces you to be like more creative and really, if you're going to sell some horror, you can't do it with just some shock value. You have to really dial up the psychological and really dial up the imagery. So, to me, the horror element as a vehicle to tell a story often doesn't get the exploration that it deserves artistically. So, and what I mean by that is, people will explore the artistry in the storytelling element of love. For instance, they'll explore the artistry in the storytelling element of beauty or of inspiration or of sadness. Sadness all the time. They really dig deep into the sadness and what makes a character sad and what affects the story with doom and gloom and, again, just sadness. But what often, or far and in between, an element of storytelling that doesn't get explored deeply enough is horror. And you might be thinking, and I know because a lot of people think this way, when you first think of horror, you might think of something like a zombie flick where you're scared of the zombies coming and tearing you apart. Or they may go into, horrific detail showing like zombies ripping people to pieces and things like that. And yes, that certainly is an interesting element to storytelling. It certainly is interesting imagery to see, but it's done. It's done to death, literally done to death. You've seen that part of horror storytelling, and I'm not saying it's lazy. It's not lazy storytelling use of horror. It's just been done. If you've seen Breaking Bad, then you've seen Spawn, then you've seen arguably Saving Private Ryan or war movies where people are just getting blown to pieces. Like, that's not enough. That's a and it's different for different stories. Like the death in Saving Private Ryan is obviously it's trying to depict, fatalities in wartime, and it's given, it fits the story. But in other horror movies, it's usually just kind of slasher stuff. It's shock value. It's the Dane Cook of horror, if you know what I mean. It's just saying disgusting things for the sake of saying disgusting things doesn't make, something comedy. And showing disgusting things and depicting disgusting things doesn't necessarily tell the story of horror as well, or use the element of storytelling of horror as well. I feel like I'm not making sense this podcast. I'm all stopped up. I've got I can hear myself in my head too much. I'm coming off of whatever my son gave me. But anyways, back to the horror thing. A good example of horror as a storytelling element done right, and I mean this because it stuck with me for years and years and years, was Emily Rose. The Exorcism of Emily Rose. That movie, I forget when it came out, early 2000s, something like that. And it wasn't, to my recollection, it wasn't like a slasher thing. It wasn't this demon's going around killing everybody and ripping heads off, and it's not like a Final Destination type of movie. It's not that. But they got the actress who's the same girl from, what's it? Her name is Carpenter? Is it one of her last names? She's in Dexter. Dexter explored the psychology of horror really well too. There was, yes, dismemberment and depicting of that, but it was psychological horror as much as it was a visual horror. But back to Emily Rose, that was a perfect example of the type of horror and storytelling that I'm talking about, and that's what Stranger Things does. They explore that deeply unsettling depiction of horror, where they're hitting you in your heart, in your stomach, and in your mind with the horror instead of just visually. if that makes sense. They're going there with the truly traumatic, emotional and mental depiction of horror, and it's amazing. And I appreciate that they use that as a storytelling vehicle. That's not the only storytelling vehicle that they get right. Another element that they get really right is love. Using love as an element to storytelling. And again, this is just my opinion in all of this. So remember, I said a few minutes ago that in the writing process, you can tell that they were having a lot of fun with season 4, and you can tell that they took everything that works in pop culture, film, and TV, and they stayed away from everything that didn't. One of the things that gets really stupid really fast in storytelling and really used poorly is the vehicle of love. Think of Pearl Harbor. The love story in Pearl Harbor ruined the movie. It was stupid. But love as a storytelling element in Stranger Things is used as effectively, in my opinion, as the horror part of it. Because in Stranger Things 4 at least, and across all the Stranger Things, the love element that they're exploring, the love element they use, is that element of selfless love. They explore selfless love and they depict selfless love. Not, I'm just going to hump everything that moves love. I'm just going to make out with everybody and have sex with everything and everybody. It's not lustful love. It's selfless love. And that is part and parcel to the horror. And I'll get into more elements that they're just using perfectly, that they're writing together perfectly. More Geek Therapy coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're talking about Stranger Things 4. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and today we are talking about Stranger Things 4, and while thus far, as of recording, we're halfway through, it's the mid-season break, basically, and we're talking about why, in my opinion, it is virtually perfect. Why Season 4 of Stranger Things isn't just virtually perfect for Stranger Things, but it's a virtually perfect piece of cinematic history, piece of TV history, why it uses the art form, that audio-visual art form perfectly in almost every single regard, and almost every single element of production and writing and sound. We haven't even got to the sound yet, but I will talk about sound. Believe me, I'm going to talk about sound, cinematography, set design, all sorts of things. But right now I'm focusing more currently on the storytelling elements that they explore beautifully and that they tell beautifully and that they write beautifully. I've covered horror and why they do the psychological horror and the visual horror perfectly. It's a traumatic horror that they depict, and I appreciate that they go to the depths they do to make your soul scared. And it's not, I've explained myself, it's not because it's a bunch of slasher horror, it's not cheap horror, it's deeply disturbing imagery and deeply disturbing psychological horror that they do perfectly. And I've just been going over the love element of storytelling, that it wasn't the love story that ruined Pearl Harbor. If you remember the movie Pearl Harbor, putting that love story in there was absolutely stupid. The love that they depict in Stranger Things is not a lustful love. It's not an ignorant love. It's not just depicting love for love's sake. The type of love they explore in Stranger Things is selfless love. And that is not very often depicted, especially in shows like this or movies like this. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble thinking today. It feels like I'm in a cloud. Selfless love isn't often explored in pop culture films. Usually what's explored in pop culture films and TV is lustful love. That's not what you're getting in Stranger Things. Now, I wanted to sort of move on to another element, because I think we've covered love. Comedy. Obviously, some people might consider Stranger Things equally a comedy as it is a horror show. I don't know what I would pin. You can't put Stranger Things in the comedy segment, but you can't. I guess it would, if you're being honest with ourselves, it would exist in the horror element. And there is comedic value in horror movies. I would say Zombieland is a comedy, because it's not really a horror picture. It's using the zombie vehicle in a comedic way. But Stranger Things, I'll just say this. The comedic relief and the dynamic between characters is also written and acted perfectly. Case in point, Dustin's character is stupid good. The actor does a marvelous job. The character of Dustin does an awesome job. And here's the thing, it's not just because of the writing, it's the directing too. And you can tell that the character of Dustin, that the actor is having that he has really natural kind of comedic timing and talent. So he makes these like faces, and they're just genuinely like authentic, like stupid, goofy, like faces looking at the other characters, like he genuinely can't believe what they said, or that he just really thinks he's smarter than this other person. Like, his faces and reactions to what other characters are saying, not just Steve, but everybody, is just freaking perfect. It's just amazing. It's so natural. It feels like you didn't tell him to act. It feels like he's just genuinely like, are you serious right now? Like, did you really say that? Like, it's how your friends look at you when you're dumb, and it's when you say something dumb. It's perfect. His reactions and comedic timing is perfect. So the comedy in the show, I wouldn't say that the comedy is 100% perfect. They do use a bit of a campy element. So think campy, like in the first Star Wars. It's kind of campy. There's kind of some silly, kind of goofy humor in there. And they certainly allude to it and use it a little bit in Stranger Things 4, but it's not overdone. You wouldn't call Stranger Things 4 or any other season a campy comedic show. The element of comedy they use to help the storytelling is not an overly campy version of humor. It's not. It's more intelligent than that. I don't know how I can really explain it. They definitely allude to campy humor without it being roll your eyes as a viewer campy. They allude to it like, because a lot of 80s movies were campy, silly humor. So they're kind of touching on that. Like, they touch on that kind of nostalgia thing, but they do it in a very fresh, modern way that lets you know that the writers and directors are definitely aware that campy, stupid comedy exists. They're letting you know that they know it exists, but they're not, overdoing it, and they know exactly when to pull back, and they know how to depict it perfectly without you noticing that it's campy. It just fits the story perfectly. It fits getting from one scene to another perfectly. So, speaking of from one scene to another, let's kind of talk about set design and cinematography. And again, I'm not an expert at like filmmaking. I mean, it is my job for the Houston Museum of Natural Science, and I'm definitely learning more and more as I go. My approach to filmmaking has always been from a position of storytelling. I've learned to do whatever I can do for my filmmaking as it comes naturally from storytelling. And another element that comes naturally from storytelling that I've learned to do, and I continue to learn to do, is cinematography and framing shots, and what's going to be in the shot, what's going to be out of the shot, what's in the shot that helps tell the story, what's in the shot that's not going to distract too much, how can I put things in the frame in an interesting way. A masterclass in cinematography, I wouldn't say is necessarily Stranger Things, although Stranger Things cinematography is immaculate, and it is. I guess some could consider it a masterclass in itself, but a masterclass in cinematography is Breaking Bad, and Better Call Saul. If you're ever curious as to what cinematography means and the effect it has on storytelling and depicting a compelling story, watch Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. Like, watch any episode. Just watch how they frame up two people talking to each other. Watch how they frame up people walking across the desert. Watch how they do these establishing shots in a very interested wide angle way, maybe a tight angle way, maybe not necessarily fisheye wide angle, but the way they set scenes with the cinematography and the way they frame up characters and elements in the scene in Breaking Bad and in Better Call Saul is some of the best cinematography that you will ever see anywhere, ever. It is amazing. A lot of it comes from, I took a Japanese film class way back as an elective. A lot of old Japanese films, like from the 50s and 60s, black and white stuff, the cinematography looks modern. You would say, oh, that looks like Breaking Bad or something. No, Breaking Bad looks like a Japanese black and white film with the establishing shots, especially like the river. Japanese cinematography, and they do this a lot now, and they do it also in Breaking Bad and some modern stuff too, but especially in older Japanese filmmaking and cinematography, they set the establishing scene for quite a long time than we're used to. They will set the camera, turn it on by a river, and you'll see like a river flowing for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, leaves kind of rustling, the sound going. So it puts you there. You're there in the scene with the actors when the actors come out onto the quote-unquote stage, because a lot of it was kind of, theater was the biggest thing, and they're trying to reproduce what all they knew how to do was theater, and there is kind of exploring this filmmaking element and what can we do with cameras now and sound now. So a lot of early filmmaking is basically coming from the old way of thinking of like, how do we film a stage, actors on a stage? Well, and before actors come out on a stage, there's usually this period where you're just kind of looking at the setting, or if there's an actor on the stage already, there is a few moments of no talking so that it really establishes the scene. Stranger Things does do that, but what Stranger Things does with cinematography, and I'll have to get into this in the last segment, is they do, what I've noticed mostly are the awesome transitions between scenes and between sets, basically, that are usually very seamless and very creative, and oftentimes you don't realize that it was as creative as it was. They do like a lot of spinning kind of camera moves and crossfades while the camera spins and things like that, and they use walls to crossfade between, like the walls of a school to crossfade, to the wall of a house kind of thing. It's a lot of that kind of stuff, which is really cool. I'm going to talk about this more. Geek Therapy Radio, don't go away. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and I'm talking about why Stranger Things 4 is one of the most perfect TV shows and pieces of cinematic storytelling that I have seen in recent memory, and probably definitely stacks up with the greatest of all time. So in the last segment, I was wrapping up talking about the cinematography. I'm not going to recap it for the radio listener. This is just going to be a plug that you're going to have to go find the podcast. Listen to the podcast in the iHeartRadio app, your Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spreaker. I use Pocket Casts on my Android. Whatever your favorite podcast app is, search for Geek Therapy Radio. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and you got me. So if you want to hear my full thoughts on the cinematography of Stranger Things 4, you can go back, listen to maybe the last half or whatever of segment 3. To wrap up the cinematography thing, yes, it's part of what makes cinematography, and this is a good lead-in, part of what makes cinematography so effective is set design. And again, I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm learning as I'm going, as I'm a storytelling filmmaker for the museum. That's my full-time job now. I learn as I go. But I've always appreciated I've always appreciated parts of cinema that a lot in TV shows and things that other people didn't seem to notice. And it's because I'm a sound guy. It's because I like cameras and things like that. I'm thinking of like, wow, that's like artistic, the direction of how the scenes are directed. I'm thinking about all these kind of behind the scenes stuff, like how the magic is made. And so I appreciate when I see great cinematography, and I appreciate when I see great set design. People don't have an idea. Here's a good kind of example here. Drones. I talk about drones a lot on Geek Therapy Radio. When part of the marketing material and all like the reviews of drones you'll see, like if you went to look up the DJI Mini 3 or the DJI Mavic 3 or whatever new drone is coming out or whatever new drone has already come out, when you watch reviews of these drones and even promotional material for these drones, but especially reviews, they're flying these drones over mountains. They're flying these drones over beautiful beaches with crystal clear blue water. They're flying these drones over like Rome and interesting architecture and amazing looking bridges. That's all you'll see in these drone reviews. And the reality is, when you get the drone to your home, you're just going to be flying around your neighborhood, and you're going to get the drone up there once or twice, and you're basically, I'm bored with it now. I've seen everything I can see around here. So there's a little extra tidbit there, is when you're buying a drone, the average person, 90% of people don't need to go after the most expensive drone just because it's the most expensive. And you watch these reviews and you see all these beautiful imageries of these exotic locations, and then you get this $2,000 drone home and you're like, well, there's my garage in 5.7K, and all right, why isn't my footage looking as good as Peter McKinnon's footage or whatever? It's because Peter McKinnon was in the Swiss Alps doing his drone review and looking at fascinating things. That was the set. His set was interesting, and it doesn't matter if you're flying a piece of crap drone up there with a 720p camera. If the set is interesting, if your environment is interesting, it's going to be compelling. So that's my appreciation to tie this back in with Stranger Things 4 and cinematography and set design, is I appreciate when they set scenes, when the scene and the set design is interesting and visually interesting and draws your eyes to different parts of the locations, or draws your eyes to an actor, draws your eye away from an actor, draws your eyes to a lamp, draws your eyes to whatever's interesting in the scene, and that the set design is so amazingly period accurate. Like it feels like it's 1986 again. I was only 3 years old in 1986, but that's when I first started getting my memories of like shag carpet and wood paneling and Nintendos and the big TVs and everything like that. It puts me there. It's like, yeah, that's what I remember, and that's what I'm seeing in all my old home movies, and that's what I see in all the old pictures, is this. They're getting that 80s design and motif and wardrobe even. I've even talked about wardrobe perfectly. Like if you have kids, if you're my age and you kind of grew up in the 80s and early 90s or whatever, and you have kids, somebody was telling me this the other day, that they were watching with their kid, and their kid is like, I can't believe you grew up in the 80s. That looks so cool. It all looks so neat. Yeah, it was neat. It was really cool in a much simpler time. I'm not going to get too much sidetracked with the nostalgia of it, but the set design and the fact that it's a period piece, Stranger Things does it perfectly. The next show that I can think of that does period pieces and period set design perfectly, a masterclass, is Mad Men. I love period shows and period movies. Half the reason I'm watching a movie like Saving Private Ryan isn't for the action of it all. It's because I like to see, cars from the 40s and Jeeps from the 40s and planes from the 40s and cities from the 40s and clothes from the 40s, or late 30s arguably also. So the point is, the set design is great, and it's a perfect period piece also. It's one of the best, if not the best, period pieces about the 1980s that anyone could possibly see right now. Like, you could watch Ferris Bueller and it still not be as good of an 80s period piece or War Games. Same actor. You can watch both those movies and it's not as good as an 80s period piece. even in its time as Stranger Things is. It's kind of weird. Maybe it's because Stranger Things is 4K and you can see it all in more detail, and it's like, oh, I'm there. I can see it better now. Okay, let's talk about sound to start kind of wrapping this up. And I'm not going to be able to talk about every element of the show and why it's perfect, but hopefully I've done a decent job of explaining my position, in my opinion. Now, sound. I mentioned on Twitter, I was like, just got done with the first half of Stranger Things 4. You bet I'm going to spend the next podcast talking about it. And Anderson reached out on Twitter. He's like, what about the sound? I'm like, dude, absolutely, I'm talking about sound. Sound is a huge part of why this show works so well. It's not just the score. Obviously, the score in soundtrack to Stranger Things is perfection. It's that 80s synthwave kind of thing, gloom, like you're thinking of Moogs and theremins and like synthesizers and keyboards and things like that. It's awesome. And like 808 drum machines. Awesome score, awesome soundtrack. What really sticks out, what is perhaps underappreciated, but I notice and I appreciate very much, is the sound effects and the way, not just the sound effects, but the way they use sound for those scene transitions. Like they'll use the sound of a truck fading into the sound of like a washing machine or something like that. They blend as the scene fades into another scene. So does sound elements fading into other sound elements, and it's amazing how they do it. It's absolutely astonishing and perfect how they do it. How everything flows and ties. It keeps your attention to the whole thing perfectly. They get the horror perfect. They get the comedy perfect. They get the love perfect. They get the cinematography, set design, wardrobe, and sound as close to perfect as possible. Speaking of Stranger Things soundtrack, you're listening to the Stranger Things intro theme. It's metalized. It's by a group called Artificial Fear. I will mention them in the description below. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. You are worthy of receiving love. And you are worthy of your own self-respect. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio today. Visit my friends at EPO in Houston, Electronic Parts Outlet. Have a wonderful week. Let me know. Email me, geektherapyradio.com. What do you think about Stranger Things 4? Let's talk about it. See you next time.